Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as always, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA, with the closing part of the section that I like to call Bowtie Talks Goes West. As we wrap up our little series on the American West, I can think of no better figure to close it out than that of the American cowboy. And as the son of a cattleman myself, and somebody who grew up around cattle, I think I'm pretty well versed enough in to discuss this subject. However, I consider the subject so large that once again I am in need of a co-host, and once again I look to my family. So please welcome the second ever co-host of Bowtie Talks, my brother Clayton.
How's it going, Bowtie Talks? As Luke said, I am Clayton Johnson, Luke's brother. We come from a rich farm and cattle background. Our grandfather was a large farmer as well as cattleman and a dairy farmer. Our father is a cattleman. I'm a cattleman. Luke one day may or may not become a cattleman as he endures in his monopolist industry and mindset as himself. But yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm thankful to be invited to be a part of this podcast and ready to share some cowboy and cattle history.
All right, well, we're going to get it started with, because before we can really talk about cowboys, of course, we have to talk about cattle. And interestingly, they have a history in this country that almost goes back to when the Americas were first discovered.
It truly does, Luke. The cattle history in the U.S., actually the first breed ever to be brought into the U.S., or really the Americas, I should say, was from Christopher Columbus, clear back in 1493, believe it or not. The cattle that were brought over from the Spanish colonies were descendants of our now Longhorn cattle and our Corriente cattle. They're the first Spanish breeds. Believe it or not, he had brought them first to the Caribbean islands. The region is now called Hispaniola, and then after they were landed in Hispaniola and bred, they were then brought to Mexico, believe it or not. And then in Mexico, the breed was further developed and then brought up into what's now Texas, because at the time Texas was still a part of Mexico. The Longhorn breed's always been hardy. They're not a big breed like the rest of our breeds. They've got long horns from where the name originated from, and the reason their horns are actually long is because they use it to radiate heat. They're really bred for their hardiness and for being in desert climates, because they don't take a lot of forage to hit what I'm going to call a slaughter weight. However, it does take them longer to hit that weight, but they're very hardy, and they don't take a lot of forage to hit that weight. But yes, the real true origins of cattle in the U.S. can be linked back to Christopher Columbus. The first breeds that really influence the market today in the U.S., believe it or not, the first, what I'm going to call English breeds, which is what we're used to today in the American cattle markets, were brought over, believe it or not, even before the Mayflower. The first English breed that was introduced into the U.S. was clear back in 1623, and that was the Devon cattle, and that was the very first actual purebred breed from England that was brought here, was the Devon. That was clear back in 1623.
Amazing.
Yes.
And about the Longhorn cattle, that's one thing that always struck me, is that for beef cattle, they're scrawny.
They are, but then again, they're bred for the desert climate. They're bred for not having a lot of available feed, but they will eventually hit that weight that we need in what's called a market weight. But they're bred to eat, they're kind of like a goat. I mean, they'll eat sage grass. They'll eat any type of forage that pops up out there in the desert climates, and including, South Texas, New Mexico, where, our hardy English breeds, yep, they're bred to put on weight. However, they're used to having full grass, full hay, full forage. They're really bred for feed. That's their efficiency, is to turn feed into weight. Whereas the Longhorn, yes, they will, but it takes less feed to get them there, but more time, if that makes sense.
That definitely does make sense. And the English breeds, but yeah, I did not know that they actually came over here before the Mayflower, which is...
Well, it's 1623. That put it right at that time, correct?
Yeah, right around that time, yes.
So I'm going to segue into a little bit. some well-known breeds that's highly influences the market today that we know.
Yes.
The first one is, of course, is the Angus. The Angus were very first brought to the U.S. in 1873 by a fellow Scotsman, as you know.
Yes, as I know, yes.
His name is George Grant, and believe it or not, the very first Angus brought to the U.S. was, in the great state of Kansas, in Victoria, Kansas, in 1883. Believe it or not, he brought over bulls first, and he crossbred them with Longhorn because he saw how hardy the Longhorn was, but they didn't put on weight. But we had ample grass here, so he put Angus bulls on Longhorn cows, which inadvertently made them pulled, which means no horns. So he ended up with a crossbred that was very hardy, but however could put on weight. And actually, the very first Angus Association was in 1883, and it was established with 60 members. So the very first Angus Association was in 1883 with 60 cattlemen coming up with the breed standard and everything else, which is also in Kansas. The next heavily influenced breed that we all know and use today was the Hereford. The very first Herefords were brought into the U.S. in 1817 by Henry Clay in Kentucky. In 1840, the breed really grew establishment. What was his name? I think it was William Sotman, and he brought in 22 head straight from Herefordshire, which really got the breed established in the U.S. He brought over 22 head from Herefordshire. Oh, excuse me, I can't read my own handwriting. So yes, he brought in 22 head, and he realized that the Herefords were more hardy and everything than the current Shorthorns. Shorthorn cattle were, of course, brought in a little bit before that. They're a dual purpose breed, but he realized that Herefords were more adapted to the climate in Texas. So that's where the Herefords came from. He was a Shorthorn rancher, but he had heard about Herefords, and then in 1840 is really when the breed got established, when William brought them over and replaced his Shorthorn herd with 22 hand-picked head from Herefordshire to replace his short herds in Texas. And then in 1881, the Hereford, the National Hereford Association was established. William Grammer is credited for starting the pulled Hereford, in which before that, all the Herefords were horned. So what he did was, of course, with genetics, any ones that were born without horns, he bred together, and that's where the pulled Herefords came from. He's credited with starting the pulled Herefords. And then, of course, with cattle, you have to have cattle ranches. And believe it or not, some would have thought Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota, are really our beef producing states. One would have thought the oldest ranch would be there. However, the oldest U.S. operating ranch is Deep Hollow, and it was established in 1658 in Montauk, New York, of all places, which is about 100 miles east of New York City. So the longest owned and operated U.S. cattle ranch is, and in fact, Deep Hollow, New York. Or excuse me, Montauk, New York. And that was started in 1658.
Wow. So before this even country became a country, we actually had access to cattle, which is definitely something interesting.
Yes, sir. And the largest operating cattle ranch in the continuous United States is the King Ranch. And the King Ranch has a deep, deep history in cattle and also horses. So the King Ranch developed the Santa Gertrudis breed, and a Santa Gertrudis at its roots basically is a Simmental crossed with I believe it's a Shorthorn, but there's a certain genetic cross in there that makes it a pure Santa Gertrudis. But that's also the largest cattle breed ever produced, is a Santa Gertrudis, and that was developed at the King Ranch. And the King Ranch can also be credited with the development of the quarter horse. And most every cattle horse in the U.S. on operating ranches and or rodeos is the quarter horse. And there's also the American Quarter Horse Association, because of course, without cowboys, you wouldn't have the horse.
That is very true. That is definitely very true. Of course, what a lot of people may not realize is that cowboys actually have their roots really in Mexican history as well, not just America.
Correct. And that's their term for cowboys was, of course, vaquero, which meant literal cowboy, boys on horses.
That is true. That is true. But of course, and then of course, what a lot of people may not realize in the overall history of things is that term was originally derogatory.
Yes and no. I did some more digging, and the very first use of the word cowboy was actually in 1725, and it was from English colonists over in England and here, and it literally meant farm boys, or like us, boys that operated the family farm that tended
Yes.
so the very first documented use of the word cowboy was in 1725, and it really wasn't a derogatory term. It just meant boys, young boys that tended the family's cattle. So that's where we literally got the word cowboy.
I did not know that. And another thing some people may not realize in the overall history of things is that they were actually a lot more diverse, the cattle ranchers, the fellows who actually did the cattle drives were, than a lot of people might think. I mean, I think that the statistics are at least 25% of them were African American.
They were, and if it didn't matter what color or race you were, as long as you're out there working side by side, it really didn't matter. I mean, the proof was in the pudding. It was the type of man you were, not the color of your skin.
That is very true.
Without cattle and cowboys, there wouldn't have been cattle drives.
Exactly.
And movies and such and everything else, it made everything believe that cattle drives were a giant part of the U.S. throughout its entire history, when really it wasn't. The very first cattle drive booms and really first cattle drives weren't until 1865, post-Civil War, and those were the very first notable cattle drives. And there were some small ones in the 1850s during the gold rush, but really the very first big cattle drives were not until post-Civil War, when the rest of the eastern U.S. really wanted a taste for beef. Until then, you didn't really get beef until you were on the family farms or on the ranches. There was a commodity for it, but back east, there really wasn't that big of a call for beef until post-Civil War.
That makes sense. Another thing that does kind of coincide with is railroad history, about which was the 2 weeks ago's episode.
Correct. Well, that's my next point. They're really, after the 1860s, 1865 would say, the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight Trail, and the Great Western Trail, and this is another part of Kansas history. Actually, those four were the biggest trails in the continuous U.S., and they really connected Texas with the Kansas railroads and Kansas City. And as you know, Kansas City used to be known as the beef mecca of the United States because of the stockyards. So the Chisholm and all those other trails led right to Kansas City. Kansas,
that's also where some of the best steak comes from, and a very particular good cut of steak, which actually happens to be my favorite.
The good old Kansas City strip.
Yep.
Which really is just the one side of the T-bone. The other side is a filet, or in the bigger, it's the porterhouse. The porterhouse is the Casey strip, the filet, and I believe either a little bit of the ribeye or the sirloin.
Yes.
So, without cowboys, you can't have the cowboy without the hat.
That is definitely true.
As we talked a little bit before, the cowboy hat did originate in Mexico with sombreros. The cowboy hat really came from being out in the elements all day. You needed something to protect your head. You needed something to protect your ears in the sun. And then in the wintertime, which is where we have our felt hats from, you needed something to keep your head warm and something to keep the snow off your ears. Believe it or not, the cowboy hat has a deeper history than that. The very first mentionings of a felt hat, or they really did have the shape of our current cowboy hats, was in Mongolia in the 13th century, and they was worn by all of their horsemen. So even back then, they were called horsemen or cowboys, clear back in the 13th century in Mongolia. All of their riders had what would almost look like a modern cowboy hat. And really our modern American cowboy hats really came from the Civil War. The felt hats, they kind of had the shape. All the cavalrymen wore them. And that's really where the first American cowboy hats came from, was the Civil War. But the very first mass-produced cowboy hats is called the Boss of the Plains, and they looked more like a modern bowler hat or an old top hat. But believe it or not, Stetson came up with the very first mass-produced cowboy hat, which was called the Boss of the Plains. It was an open crown. It was a shorter brimmed hat, but Stetson came up with the very first mass-produced cowboy hat clear back in 1865, which then again turned the Civil War, when really the beef boom happened.
Oh yes.
And some more into some hat history. The most recognized really cowboy hat, of course, has the cattleman's crease.
Yes.
Which the cattleman's crease is, there's a crease on either side of the crown with a dimple down the middle. And the cattleman's crease really originated by cattlemen today, where they would have, or back then, every time they'd pull off their hat, eventually it would wear down over time, and that crease would happen. So you'd get the pinch sides with the crease down the middle from that open crown from Stetson. And then eventually cattlemen just decided to get their hat shaped like that so it wouldn't ruin the hat. If they started out with their hat like that, it wouldn't ruin it. And just started by grabbing the sides of the hat, and that shape came naturally. But then they just decided to shape it like that.
Necessity is definitely the mother of invention, and that definitely shows through in that case.
It does. It does, absolutely. And then, of course, any cowboy worth of salt is going to have a pair of boots. And really our first cowboy boots, then again, went back to the Spaniards and in Mexico. The conquistadors already had those tall metal boots. They were designed for, to keep when you're riding. Back then, there weren't any trails. So there was, of course, long grass, spines, cactuses, whatever they're riding through. It was everything to protect your shins. And then after that, this as trails and stuff was being cut, it started getting made into leather because, leather comes from cattle and cattle production. So then they started being made out of leather. And believe it or not, some more Kansas history. One of the very first patents for cowboy boots came from the Olathe Boot Company. That was started by the Hires. Hire Boots held the very first patent for what we now know as cowboy boots. And Olathe Boots sold to, I think, like Justin and Tony Lama, that conglomerate. But recently, I believe it was last year, the great-great-grandson of Hire bought the patent back. So now Hire Boots are back to being owned by the original family that started with the boot company.
Well, it should definitely stay in the family name, that's for sure.
Yes, sir. And then, of course, with boots come jeans. Jeans really didn't become popular for the working man or really cattlemen until the gold rush. And when the gold rush happened, denim jeans were cheap and all the pockets were sewn. And this can be brought back to California and the late great Levi Strauss. Miners, he was a blacksmith and he was a tailor, and miners kept bringing him their jeans and their denim to be repaired. And as a joke and a whim, a miner brought him a pair of jeans. He's like, "Why don't you just put rivets in these dang things?" And he did, and it took off. And he came up with a patent, I believe it was in 1856, for the very first pair of riveted denim jeans, which now all of our workwear that's not FR rated all has rivets in all the pockets. And that's so it didn't rip out when you had tools in your pockets.
Yes, and of course, to this day, the most famous brand of jeans still bears the name of the inventor.
They do, indeed. And and another thing with cowboys, between all the movies and westerns and everything that people watch, every cowboy on the trail or in town, everybody had a gun on their hip. And believe it or not, that's a fallacy that was made up by Hollywood. In pretty well every single town, when you rode into town, if you had a gun on your hip, it was turned into the marshal the second you walked into every town. The whole notion of every cowboy having a 357 or a 44 or what have you on their hip, that was a complete and utter fallacy. They did carry long guns on their saddles, of course, because of coyotes and whatever else have you out there on the plains. But still, whenever they rode into town, nary a cowboy never had a gun on their hip.
See, well, and of course, I think that's also a lot of the mythos around the American West can really be point back to Hollywood.
And it can. And one of the true, what would you say, the pioneers of cinema, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it Buffalo Bill clear back in the 1920s with the traveling? Didn't he have Buffalo
Bill?
Yes,
yes. The traveling Wild West shows, yes, back in the 1890s, yes.
Well, he lived clear until I believe it was like 1923 or 4, wasn't it?
Yeah, right around that time. Yes, that is right. Yes.
Yes, and that's really where the whole I have a pistol on my hip and I'm going to go into town and get in shootouts. That's really where that came from. But even he himself knew that's not really how it was. That was just portraying a fallacy for the folks back east.
I can definitely see that. And that explains why in that one John Wayne movie where he's at the Cowboys, where he has all those young boys and he says, "All right, everybody pack an iron on this trip, put it in this box," or whatever the line is.
Correct. Yes. Well, that was because of Luke, what was his name? Cimarron.
Yes.
Because he went to pull iron on that kid because what did he say? Oh, tu madre
es puta.
Do you know Spanish?
I know. Yes, I know Spanish.
Oh, what else would you like to hit on, Brother Luke?
Well, let me see. I think we covered that. And then, you've already mentioned his name, but in regards to the whole Lonesome Dove miniseries, of which we're both big fans, admittedly.
Yes.
Charles Goodnight, of course. I really think that's another thing where the whole cowboy mythos kind of got started in regards to the two trails.
Yes.
I really think that he was really, and I guess it had to be said, but he was really strict with his man, and I guess he had to be at that situation.
You did, and there was some truth to a little bit of correct that the whole lonesome dove where his buddy had died and he was going to bring him back to where he said he wanted to be buried. But yeah, if you were a lawman, of course you could carry all of your guns and everything in towns, and of course there was outlaws and such, as the James brothers and Butch Cassidy and what have you. But it's truly, the whole made up. There was never any duels, as far as what we know of high noon walking out cowboys. There's not really any documented cases of true duels in the middle of the street. That's another Hollywood thing. And as the one of the greatest westerns of all time, as we know, Tombstone, the late great Val Kilmer, who played the greatest rendition of Doc Holliday. That was one of the very notable gunfights at the OK Corral. That's one of the very true, cowboys wore their guns to town. Another cool thing, since we are Masons, I'm trying to remember in that movie, it wasn't Texas Jack, it was Turkey Creek Johnson, actually. As you can see in the movie, the actor had a square and compass on his necklace. Well, not only was the actor a Mason, you can correct me if I'm wrong later, is either Turkey Creek or Texas Jack, but I think it was Turkey Creek. He was an actual brother Mason, and he was an outlaw with the Cowboys, but then rode with Doc Holliday and all of them towards the end of his life, and he was a brother Mason. So not only was the actor, but so was the man himself.
Well, I'll have to dive into that some more. Definitely have to dive into that some more.
Yeah, nope. He was a fellow brother Mason. Oh, yes.
But yes, I was trying to think around some of the more mythos, because I know we already talked about how gunfights didn't actually happen.
Right.
And then, of course, some of the branding. I don't want to talk about branding because the last thing I need to do is to be protested by PETA. Those dirty.
No, but branding has always been a part of having cattle. That was the only way to go apart, because really barbed wire didn't come into fruition until the mid to late 1800s.
And even then, through a lot of protest.
Yes, that's when there was still a lot of, there were just territories and not states. So anybody could go out there and claim that was their land. But the only way to differentiate your cattle from anybody else's was from brands. So brands were the only, because they didn't have ear tags back then. So the only way to tell your cows from somebody else's was, of course, from a brand.
Yes, that is definitely true, and I'm just glad that we have developed alternate techniques to these days. However, apparently that's something else that kind of came around that is apparently still quite a problem to this day, at least from what our father tells me, cattle rustling.
No, it always will be. It's an easy way to make money, but it's no different than any other thief. But as long as there's been cattle thieves, and that's why we have a livestock commission, livestock agency, livestock agents, cattle wrestling and as long as there's cows, there's going to be cattle wrestlers.
That is definitely true. It's kind of like the hold'em, one follows the other.
Right. Well, you can't really have cows without a good working dog.
That is very true.
And the working dog history in the U.S. is just as deep as the cattle. The blue heeler, stumpy tail cattle dog, or whatever you want to call it, of course, came from Australia, and they came from crossing really deeply kelpies with their dingoes. That's where that real hard bite comes from. In the blue heelers is from, they have dingo bred into them. And really, believe it or not, the Australian wild dingo is the last, I'm going to say, really purebred dog in the world. And you can look up, the dingo has the genetics of any dog in the world, but that's where the blue heeler came from, was really the Australian kelpie being bred with dingoes. And then where the spots came from in the blue heelers, believe it or not, came from Dalmatians after they were brought here. After them kelpie dogs came over that were crossed with the dingoes from Australia, were bred with the Dalmatians that were in the U.S., which Dalmatians, where they got their headway and really head start. And that's why you see the pictures of Dalmatians with firefighters. They were bred to run along the sides of the horses that were pulling the pump carts in fire situations to keep the horses on the road. So they noticed that they could keep animals in line, so they bred that with the bite of the dogs they brought over from Australia, and that's how you got the blue heeler. And another fun fact, the Australian Shepherd isn't from Australia at all. The Australian Shepherd was bred in California, really with the base of the breed being from Border Collies, which of course came over from Scotland and England, and they were bred with. There is some blue heeler in the origins of Australian cattle dogs and or Australian Shepherds, and some of the they have origins back to Portugal, and the Portuguese sailors coming into ports of California, and their herding dogs were bred with border collies, and that's where the Australian Shepherd came from, believe it or not. So the the one dog with Australia in their name has no ties to Australia whatsoever.
Well, yes, I guess maybe they should have been called the American Shepherds or something along those lines.
They should have. And then another great cow dog that's used on working ranches all throughout the U.S. is the Catahoula. And the Catahoulas came from Louisiana, in the Catahoula region of Louisiana. I think Catahoula came from, I believe it was the Seminoles, and that was a word they had for their dogs. Catahoula was just the not the name, but the way they pronounced it. So that was the phonetics of that dog. And that dog was also bred with the blackmouth curs down there, and that's the Catahoula hound, as it can be called. But most of the time, those are used as a catch dog, and they're really a dual purpose dog. They've got a great nose on them, so guys will turn them out on big ranges to go out and find their cattle and gather them. And then most of the time after they're gathered, they'll turn out a border collie or a blue heeler or something to, get them gathered and get up in the trailer. But those Catahoulas they're a great cow dog. They're more of a scent dog and a catch dog. And yeah, on the bigger ranges, especially down in Texas or even up here, they'll turn those dogs out on them surly Brahmas and get them gathered, and then we'll turn out another different cow dog, getting bred and put back up. What else you got for me, big guy?
Well, I hate to say this, but we've only got about 5 more minutes.
Oh boy. So yeah, we've hit on dogs, we've hit on early breeds of cows, we've hit on early range, we've heard on terminology, we've hit on hats, we've hit on jeans, we've hit on boots, we've hit on
the whole cattle trails and such.
Cowboy stereotype.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we've got everything covered, and like you said, I still have to edit this thing.
Yeah, I know. There'll be parts that we edit out. I was just thinking anything else that you'd want cowboy or cattle related.
No, I think we've got about everything covered here.
Yeah. Did you have any other research that I didn't hit on?
Well, regards to that, because it was one thing that I was talking about here was that how really the early Spanish cowboys were called, like you said, vaqueros, and that's really about the only thing I had. Okay. Apparently, that's actually where the term buckaroo originates.
It is.
Because I guess it may be the early Americans had a hard time pronouncing the V, so it came out like a B maybe, or something around like that.
Vaquero, buckaroo. Yeah.
Yes.
That could probably be brought back to some more of that French origin.
Yes. Well, thank you for this, Clayton. I might have to have you on again sometime.
Sounds good, buddy.